morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. This webinar is around employment issues for people on direct payments via a personal budget or personal health budget. Sorry, next slide, Gaynor. Oh, sorry about that.
Sorry, my slides have gone funny. That's it. I practice this.
So this is the That's okay. So this is the fourth webinar as part of a series that we're hosting for people to share and learn and get some good information during the coronavirus crisis. This webinar will be recorded so that others are able to see this publicly, and will be on the Be Human website that we'll give the link to afterwards. As I've said, this webinar is specifically about employment for direct payment employees and employees. So how to participate, for those that you've been on the webinar before, you'll be used to this. We probably will be able to take some verbal questions today directly from people who are attending. So if you want to do this, you raise your hand, that little hand that's on the screen, and then we can come and we'll be able to unmute you to get some verbal questions during the webinar. Or you can go through to the written question via the question panel, and you can type in that some of you are already doing and we're collecting, and thank you for all the questions that came in advance as well. We're already working to theme them and group them together. So I'm really pleased to welcome Stephen Robson. Thank you, Stephen, who's going to give us an overview presentation based on some of the themes that have already been raised by this community. Stephen's a senior solicitor with the Disability Law Service and has 20 years experience in employment law with a focus on discrimination. So thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us, and I will now mute myself and hand over to you.
Thank you, Julie, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to this talk. These are interesting times, to quote the old Chinese curse, and the situation is very fluid. So this talk is going to be our best understanding of what the issues, how employment law touches on the issues which people are facing. I can't promise that I have a definitive answer to everything, but I'll do the best I can. What I'm going to do is give a quick overview of how the law has changed, and then answer some of the questions which have already been raised in this presentation, and then we'll move on and take questions as they come in. So if we could have the next slide. As I say at the top of this slide, the basic rule is that the employment law hasn't really changed very much, and the basic rules remain. That attaches to things like unfair dismissal. If you have an employee who's been employed for 2 years or more, they have the right not to be unfairly dismissed, and that continues. Obviously, the current circumstances may give rise to circumstances where termination may be appropriate, but we certainly hope not. But the basic position for people who are on this talk is that it's for people who are receiving direct payments to pay for their own care in accordance with their personal budget. It's possible that those payments are being used to contract with a care company who then provide the carers themselves. In those circumstances, that company is an employer of the carers themselves. You are not the employer, and therefore the issues which we're touching on today shouldn't apply to you as such. They're more problems for the company that you're contracting with. And yeah, obviously there will be issues which they're facing. If any of you are in that situation, I wouldn't be surprised if you've already had discussions with these care companies about how things are going to carry on. But you're not concerned with basic employment law yourself. If any of those employees need to be furloughed, or if they're getting statutory sick pay, that's a question for the company you're dealing with and not for you. Moving on though, you also have situations where you're not contracting with a company as such, but you have somebody who comes in to provide your care. From an employment, for the purposes of this talk, we're dealing with people who are your employee. I know that many people who receive direct payments don't necessarily appreciate the situation of being an employer, which has been thrust upon them in many cases, but that's often the case. But if you have somebody who comes in on a more casual basis and you use your payments for, you're not necessarily their employer. They may technically be in business by themselves. There's a very long history of legal cases about whether somebody is an employee or not, and I'm not going to go into that in detail today, but a basic provision may be that if they are sending you invoices for the hours that they work rather than you paying them through PAYE, they're probably their own employer, they're self-employed. But if you are paying them and you're having to make PAYE deductions, then you are most likely their employer. If they are self-employed and you're just contracting them on an hourly basis, how you treat them during this crisis depends upon your own agreement with them rather than the employment law as such. We can take questions on that at the end, but it's not what I'm going to concentrate on in this talk. Moving on. I think we've gone back to where we were. One of the things you'll have heard a lot of in the news is about key workers. As you're probably aware, people who are doing a normal job, a non-essential job, such as a lawyer, shouldn't be leaving home at the moment. And that's why I'm sitting on my sofa rather than in my office to give this talk. But people whose work is essential to keep everything going are entitled to leave the house to go to work. And unsurprisingly, the list of essential workers doesn't include care workers. So we shouldn't have a situation where your carers are saying that they can't attend work because the government's told them not to leave home. That rule doesn't apply. They are entitled to come and work for you. And they shouldn't be stopped by the police en route to say this is non-essential work. More pertinently, as is said in the third point on this slide, this means that they are entitled to have any dependents continue at school. It's obviously an issue for many PAs in that if they have young children, it would be difficult to pretend to provide care at the same time as having to look after their own children. But insofar as schools are open, and obviously there are lots of different local arrangements for this, but they are the people who can require the schools to take in their children during the school day. Hopefully you shouldn't be having problems with this, but it may be an issue. So that covers the fact of key workers. Moving on. Health and safety is the next issue, and it's another issue where the law has not changed. As an employer, you have a duty to take reasonable care for the health and safety of your employees. This provides quite an issue in the current circumstances because, as everyone will have heard in the news, the main difficulty at the moment is the provision of PPE for NHS workers, workers in care homes, and we're hearing every day about the issues about getting the PPE to hospitals and care homes, saying that they need it as well. What doesn't come up in the news is provision of PPE for people providing care in the home. And as a few of you probably found already, getting such equipment, if you need it, is probably proving difficult. Unfortunately, I can't point out a way of getting around that. But the issue is a care worker may legitimately wish to avoid working without PPE. That obviously creates difficulties for you if they won't work without the equipment. But at the same time, it may be in your best interests because obviously they may have coronavirus infection themselves without knowing it as yet. And if they work without the equipment, there's always a danger that you acquire it from your carer. So ideally, personal protection equipment would be used at all times when care is being provided by somebody who doesn't live in the same house as you. But that is an ideal world, and obviously a balance has to be struck between the need for you to have care and protecting both parties. Where that balance lies is a vexed question, but it's something you need to be aware of. I would mention, when looking at this, one aspect of the Employment Rights Act says that if you dismiss an employee because they've raised health and safety concerns, or because they refuse to work because they perceive an imminent threat to their safety, that's an automatic unfair dismissal. So if a PA says they're not prepared to work because there's no PPE, it would be a very difficult thing to dismiss them because of that, because that potentially would be an unfair dismissal and lay you open to a claim in the employment tribunal as and when the tribunals reopen. So hopefully those situations won't arise, but it's something to be aware of. Okay, moving on to the next slide, please. So we now have the Coronavirus Act 2020, which has been brought in a bit of a rush last week. It's a very long piece of legislation, and inevitably, when a very large piece of legislation is brought in very quickly, there will be things which come out of it which are unexpected. Much of the news about it has been to do with its effect on employment matters, but in truth, the only actual change to employment legislation which is being brought in focuses on two distinct areas: the statutory sick pay regulations and to do with furloughing employees. Looking at statutory sick pay, which is on the next slide, the rule is that effective from the 13th of March, statutory sick pay is payable from the first day of absence. Previously, it could only be paid after you've been absent.
Sorry, Stephen, your voice is drifting in and out from the microphone.
Okay, I should try and make sure it stays in the same place. Apologies, everyone.
Yeah,
as I said, as of the 13th of March, SSP is payable from the first day of absence rather than having to wait for 4 days. This was so that people who would otherwise be obliged to self-isolate but wouldn't want to because they wouldn't get paid will have more of an incentive to stay away. So if you are employing a PA and you're sticking rigidly to the SSP regulations and only paying them SSP when they are off sick, you now have to do that from the first day and not wait. Second thing to notice, it's payable not just for sickness absences, but when your PA is not coming to work because they're following the government guidance to self-isolate. If they're self-isolating, they don't have to go to the GP to get a fit note. There is an online form which they can obtain and fill in, which confirms that they're not attending because of self-isolation. And then the pertinent thing for most people who are employing a carer is that you'll be able to reclaim the first 2 weeks of SSP for COVID-related absences. That includes people who are self-isolating because they live with somebody who is showing the signs, who are required to self-isolate for 14 days. And therefore, if your PA can't come to work for 2 weeks because they're self-isolating, the situation now is that you pay them SSP for the whole of the period, and you will be able to reclaim that from the DWP in due course, although with a lot of things, quite how you'll do that is not yet clear. Watch this space for how that happens. Obviously, as I said, this is if you are sticking to the SSP regulations when your PA is off sick. I know a lot of employers just have a tendency to, for short absences, just to continue to pay people as they would normally. as acting of goodwill, and also sometimes because it's easier for doing the administration. And if you normally pay full sick pay, you just continue to do so. You obviously have the opportunity to reclaim the SSP element of that in due course, as long as you keep a copy of the isolation note. But as I say, if that's your normal practice, just carry on as before. That pretty much covers what the SSP regulations say. We can deal with any aspects of that in due course, but we'll now move on to furloughing employees. Furlough is a word which didn't used to get used very much in English until about 2 weeks ago, but it's now everywhere. And it comes out of the government's job retention scheme, which is there to protect the jobs of people for whom there is no work for them to do. Because,
excuse me, Stephen, can you just start on furlough again, because the sound was sort of drifting on and off again.
okay, apologies for this. I hope it's not my internet connection, but okay, furlough is a word which probably nobody had heard of until a couple of weeks ago. It's now everywhere, and it covers a situation where, in order to ensure that people have jobs once the crisis has passed, an employer simply puts all their employees to one side and says, you don't have to come into work, you don't have to do any work, but we're not going to terminate your employment, we're just going to leave you on the shelf. The government now has the job retention scheme, whereby they cover 80% of the monthly salary of any employee who's been furloughed, up to a maximum of 2,500. There's a few rules which apply to this, and I've set them out here. This is for people who are fully furloughed. You can't put somebody on a part-time contract and claim the money back from the government for the time that they're not working. They have to be furloughed for a minimum of 3 weeks. And the way the regulations appear to work, you probably need to get them to agree to be furloughed, or at least sign something acknowledging that they're being furloughed. That shouldn't be a difficulty, because in most cases, the alternative to being furloughed will be having your employment terminated. And on to the next slide. If you did dismiss somebody, rather than just put them on a furlough, they would potentially have an unfair dismissal claim. And given that the test for unfair dismissal is generally, was it fair to dismiss somebody in all of the circumstances of the case, many of them would have a very strong claim, because they would say there was no need to dismiss them. You could have, as I say, furloughed them, reclaimed the government money from the job retention scheme, and maintained their employment. And if you did terminate somebody's employment rather than furloughing them, you'd have to pay them for their notice period. So general advice is not to dismiss anybody at this period. If there is no work for them to do, it's better to furlough them, reclaim the money, and reconsider the situation when things get back to normal. The job retention scheme only covers 80% of the salary of a furloughed employee, but under their contracts, they will still be entitled to their full salary unless they agree to take a lesser sum. I know that we've been getting inquiries from people who have been given furlough agreements by their employers, asking them to take either 80% or 90% of their salary, on the basis that the employer says they simply can't meet the difference between the government payment and the full salary. But under your contract, you would be entitled to your full salary because you are willing and able to work, and therefore, unless you can reach agreement with your employee, you still have to pay them the full amount. Now, fourth point on this says that government guidance suggests that public funding should not be used to furlough employees. So in a situation when you're receiving a direct payment, which when it is made is public money, the guidance says that you should probably not say to your PAs, there's no work for you to do, don't come in. my understanding is that the direct payments will continue to be made, so you will still continue to receive the full sum there, and therefore you should have sufficient money to make salary payments to the PAs, whatever. So the need to be furloughed probably doesn't arise. And it does beg the question whether it would be appropriate to furlough a carer anyway. Furlough is typically applicable to businesses which just aren't operating during the current crisis, but for most people who need care, the need for care is still continuing. So in those circumstances, there shouldn't be a need to claim on the job retention fund, but each situation will depend on its own facts. So we'll probably look at this later when we're dealing with questions. So moving on. Now looking at various questions which have been raised in advance of this seminar, because I felt that this was probably the most practical way to address things rather than
Hi, Stephen. Sorry, the sound's drifting again. What's happening is it's just going really, really quiet, and then the volume's coming up again. So I don't know whether it's how close you are.
Maybe just, but the way I move my head whilst I'm speaking, I'll try and keep myself very still, and hopefully this won't happen again.
Right, still quite low at the moment.
Is that any better?
Yes, that's better. Thank you.
Okay. Again, just wave if anything goes wrong. And so that's just a very brief discussion of employment law, because most people tuning in today, you don't want to hear from me what the law says. You want to hear practically how it affects situations which have arisen. And therefore, in the next few slides, we're looking at some of the questions which have been sent in advance of this talk, just so that we can give examples of those. And then we'll move on, and any further questions which have been put in which aren't covered, Julie will send to me, and hopefully we'll be able to deal with them. So probably one of the most pertinent questions which came in is, what do you do if you don't want your carer to attend? And obviously, this is there are probably numerous people in this circumstance around the country, because you don't want to expose yourself to any unnecessary risk. Many people who are receiving direct payments, I anticipate, count as being in the most vulnerable, who are required to stay inside for the next 12 weeks. And as part and parcel of being the most vulnerable people in the country, you're probably the most, people who have to avoid coronavirus more than anybody. You are entitled to ask your carer not to attend work. Effectively, that is what a furlough of an employee is. You just say to them, please don't come in for the next however long. It could be up to 12 weeks. It could be just a couple of weeks. It depends on your own circumstances. They remain your employee. If they're willing and able to work, they are entitled to be paid in the normal course of events. So all you have to do is say, please don't attend for the next however long, but you still have to process their salary through payroll. If they are a 0 hours worker, so you don't pay them for a set amount of time each week, but they come in on an as and when basis, you can still ask them not to attend. If you have a 0 hours worker, effectively there's no obligation on you to offer them work at any time. So you can just say, I've got no work for you today. There's a slight foible in the job retention scheme, because it does suggest that 0 hours workers can potentially be furloughed and you could reclaim 80% of their salary, but I'm not sure that's necessarily going to apply to VAs, both because you'll continue to receive your full personal budget, and therefore, if it is your practice to want to pay them to until they come back to look after you once the current crisis is finished, you'll be able to do so without making a claim on the job retention scheme. But also, if it's a situation where they are simply casual workers and they just come in when you ask them to, you probably don't need to make any payment to them. If you do make a payment and you do want to make a claim on the job retention scheme, that's based on their average pay, either over the last year or in the run-up so far this year, in the run-up to it, whichever is greater. But I'm not anticipating that will apply to many PAs. So generally, if you receive your full personal budget, then you pay your PA from it, and there shouldn't be a need to claim under the job retention scheme. You may, if you feel that you don't want third-party carers to attend, you can ask members of your family to provide care during this period. In those circumstances, you're effectively furloughing any external PA, asking them not to come in to do the work, and instead you're asking somebody within your family. Obviously, if you want to get local authority approval to formally pay your family member from the personal budget, you can ask for that. But this is probably not a situation where the job retention scheme applies. You can't employ a family member as an alternative to a furloughed employee and then make a claim back from the job retention scheme. And therefore, you do need to be careful about using your budget if you are going to go through this process. That covers that question. So moving on, issue of what happens if your PA has to self-isolate. And obviously, if they have to self-isolate, you probably don't want them attending anyway. But as I mentioned a few minutes ago, under the new legislation, they'll be entitled to be paid.
Steve, it's dropped out again. Sorry.
Sorry, I'm trying to hold the microphone in the right place. My hand moves without me realising. Apologies, everybody. Okay, if your PA has to self-isolate, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, they now are entitled to receive statutory sick pay from day one of their self-isolation. They just need to complete an isolation form rather than getting a GP's fit note. And insofar as the self-isolation period covers will be 2 weeks, you should be able to reclaim that money from HMRC. It would seem that you're able to reclaim that beyond the personal budget, and therefore this should help if you need to employ somebody else to provide care during that time. But generally, if your PA has to self-isolate, you have to accept that that's the situation, and it's best if they don't come into your house in any event. If we could have the next slide. This is a question which has been raised. If your PA is sick but not eligible for SSP, that's my typo at the top. It's statutory sick pay, not statutory pay. Again, the usual rules apply. Nothing has changed. If an employee cannot attend work because they're sick or because they're self-isolating, but they don't qualify for statutory sick pay, then unless it's your normal practice to pay them sick pay in any event, you don't have to make any payment to them. As I've mentioned, the danger this leads to is that somebody who won't receive anything if they don't attend work may well have an ulterior motive to come to work and thereby expose you to potential danger. So in those circumstances, you're entitled to ask them not to work. It's going back to the question a couple of slides ago, and what do you do if you don't want your PA to attend? You just have to ask them not to attend. The difficulty is there that you probably have to pay them in full if the reason that they're not coming to work is because you've asked them not to, rather than them deciding that they shouldn't attend because of their being sick or because they need to self-isolate. I think safety first is the main thing here. So if you think that your PA might attend if you don't ask them not to. It's better to ask them not to and pay them rather than have them insist on attending you. Moving on. This is a question which has also been raised. Can you have just your PA living in with you in a lockdown situation where you effectively self-isolate together and other PAs are just paid a retention? Effectively, here you would be furloughing your other employees, your other PAs, and just relying on one or two to provide all of your care. Now, this is a situation where the furlough most likely does apply, and subject to any PA agreeing to this arrangement, then you should be able to enter into a new arrangement where they do move in with you and provide your care on an ongoing basis, whilst anybody else who's contracted is asked to stay at home. Now, the payment arrangement's obviously going to be flexible in these situations. You'll have to work out what you're going to pay to the people who live in. And it's not clear that you'll be able to claim from the job retention fund if this meant that the total amount that you had to pay went up, because you'd still technically be obliged to pay your furloughed employees unless you could persuade them to accept a reduced amount. But anybody living in may well want an increased payment. It's not something I can say definitively what to do, because it all depends on what you can agree with your PAs. But hopefully they would be able to, you'd be able to reach some agreement. As I mentioned in the second point on this slide, you can rotate the employees being furloughed. If you are making a claim on a job retention fund, they have to be furloughed for a minimum of 3 weeks. So you could have a rotation every 3 weeks. Although whether you want to do so obviously depends on whether you want to change the people coming in and out of your house, because it would possibly increase the risk of infection. And going back to a question a couple of pages before, it may be that in these situations it's more appropriate to employ a family member to live in with you, and subject to local authority approval, pay them whilst furloughing all of the current PAs. In those circumstances, it might be possible to make a claim on the job retention fund, although it's not quite clear as yet. The next question which was raised concerns whether a PA can bring their children with them if their school is closed. As I mentioned earlier, care workers are key workers, and therefore schools should be providing ongoing education for their children. This obviously depends upon local arrangements. I know not all schools are open, and subject to local arrangements, it's often one school in the area.
Hi Stephen, it's dropping up and down again, so if you can just start wide again. Thank you.
Okay, actually, is that any better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. The main point, if your PA says that she wants to bring her children with her, bringing more people into the house simply increases the risks for everybody. So it's not something we'd recommend. You're entitled to say, no, you can't bring children with you. You can say that's not feasible. But obviously, if the situation is that there is no local schooling being provided for them, it may put your PA in an impossible position, in that they won't, they need to provide childcare. And the truth is, in most circumstances, given the choice between looking after their children and looking after you, they're more likely to look after their children. So it's something to play by ear, but it's finding that balance, because I don't recommend that you allow more people than absolutely necessary into your house, but you do need ongoing care. Probably the ideal solution, again, is to ask her not to attend and to ask a family member to provide care, but that's obviously not going to be possible for everybody. If they themselves choose not to attend, they say, I can't come to work because I need to look after my children. They're not absent because of sickness, so you don't actually need to pay them during that period. So that would potentially give you a budget to pay a family member if you wanted to provide the care in that way. And equally, on basic employment law, deciding not to turn up for work is potentially a disciplinary matter, but in the current circumstances, it's not something that we recommend going through. We don't recommend going through termination at the moment with anybody because it's just likely to lead to more complications in the future. Next question we had was for people in a high-risk category, telling you that you need to stay at home for 12 weeks and whether your PA could still work. The basic answer to this is yes, they can. It's you that needs to stay at home. You will need, as long as your PA isn't somebody who has been told to self-isolate, or if they're not showing symptoms, they can still attend and provide you with care. A more pertinent question probably is what happens if you yourself start showing symptoms, because in those circumstances your PA would probably be recommended not to work with you unless there was personal protection equipment available, and obviously we appreciate that that's not going to be easily found in most circumstances. Hopefully that doesn't arise, but it may be a situation where you just have to get onto 111 and say, unless the NHS can provide some care, then you're going to be in a critical situation because you have to be looked after both because of the infection and because of your personal care needs. And I don't know whether the NHS would admit you to hospital in those circumstances, because that in itself probably increases risk. But we'd hope it doesn't arise. But it's something to probably ask us about if and when it does come to that. That's the questions which I've dealt with, which were sent to me beforehand. We're now basically throwing it open to the floor for questions which you've been sending in, which Julie's hopefully going to relay to me.
Thanks, Steve. I'll jump in. It's Carey. While Julie's responding. I think there's a lot of questions around furlough and the kind of public funds that we probably need to look a bit more into. There's one question around what to do if the PA is shielded.
When you say shielded?
So in the shielded category, so the people who are unable, the PA themselves is somebody who is in that category, the 1.5 million people who have a significant risk and are vulnerable.
Yeah. So the PA themselves has been advised not to leave home for 12 weeks because of things. Obviously, if the PA is advised they can't work, they shouldn't be coming. Initially, they're in self-isolation, so it would seem that they're entitled to be paid SSP for that period, because they're not attending work because they're self-isolating rather than being sick. So all you need to do in those circumstances is pay them SSP. As I mentioned, for the first 2 weeks of that SSP, you can reclaim that from HMRC, from the DWP, although we're not quite sure how as yet.
Yeah.
But it would seem that after that first 2 weeks, you just have to pay them SSP in the normal course of events. But the more pertinent question is, if your PA is in that shielded category, how do you get a replacement? Because it doesn't remove your need for care.
Yeah.
So just a quick follow-up, Stephen, from that coming through is, will the SSP be reclaimable for the full 12-week period that people are suggesting they need to isolate from?
The regulations as they stand now just say that 2 weeks SSP will be reclaimable, and after that it's down to the employer to bear the cost of it, as it was before the new regulations came in. It's probably something which wasn't fully thought through when they pushed the Act through last week, because I doubt that they anticipated that the most vulnerable people would also be employees. It's if you're in that category, you're likely dismissed as somebody who's not productive, I'm afraid to say. So that's why they didn't take into account the fact that people in that category will still be working and will now be prevented from working. But unfortunately, as things stand, it's only the first 2 weeks which are reclaimable.
Yeah. So again, there might be then that people are wanting to pay the full wage, because some people are paid more than SSP. The other one on furlough, Stephen, is this confusion around, can we really furlough staff if they're using public money? So it's that it's the old chestnut of, is a direct payment still classified as public money once it leaves the council or the CCG for a direct payment?
I'm not going to give an answer to that because it's probably not up to me. But I mean, it's the issue of what a furlough actually is. I mean, the easy way to see a furlough, employees being furloughed, is to look at a coffee shop and thinking, well, it's had to close down for the period until they're allowed to reopen. The owner wants to ensure that the employees remain his employees at the end of the time, so he's allowed to furlough them, effectively keep them on the books, but not require them to attend work, and the cafe can reclaim 80% of the pay. For a PA, you're not really generally in that situation, because the need to provide care doesn't stop, and because carers are key workers, the expectation is that you will keep working, and therefore, in most circumstances, carers shouldn't be furloughed. But as we discussed, you may need to rearrange your care arrangements, which will involve asking some of your PAs not to attend, and they are technically furloughed. Now, insofar as you're using the direct payment to pay their salary, I don't think that anybody's going to raise an issue if you receive what are public monies when they're paid by the local authority, although they may not be when you receive them, and use that to pay the salary of your PA, even though you're not asking them to attend work, because the reason you're not asking them not to attend work is for your own health and safety, rather than because there's no work for them to do. So I think insofar as they're being furloughed for health reasons, it's not going to be an issue that the fact that the money being used to pay their salaries is from public funds.
And it's been really helpful. Thanks, Olivia. Olivia's just put a note saying that on the Gov website it does talk about using furlough for those PAs that are shielding. So it sounds like it is possible to do that. Another one around the isolation. So if a PA is isolating due to their children having symptoms, would that then be sick leave or something else? Because in effect, they're not sick themselves, but need to be home because their children are?
Well, if they're home because their children are showing symptoms, they're probably in a situation where they're recommended to self-isolate. Because if you're sharing a house with somebody who's showing symptoms, you have to self-isolate, and the change to the SSP means that SSP is payable for somebody who is self-isolating in those circumstances. So although it's not technically sick leave, that you can still pay SSP, whether you have to pay, if it's your habit of paying full pay for the occasional day or week of absence through sickness, whether you have to do that is another question. You probably don't have to, but if they're self-isolating in accordance with guidelines, then yes, they are entitled to SSP for that period.
Great. There are some questions now. We'll just open it up and ask for some verbal. So the first one, Catherine, I'm just coming to unmute you now to ask your question. Hi, Catherine.
Oh, is that me?
It is.
Hello.
Hi. Hello. Yeah, I've been asking questions about furlough and the public funding, and I think you've covered that, because in theory the direct payment should continue, and so therefore there is money. There is money to pay PAs.
So you shouldn't really need to make a claim on the job retention fund.
Yeah, I think the issue with a lot of people that I'm speaking to is that they want some reassurance from CCGs or local authorities that the direct payment will continue, and it won't be stopped because they're no longer using paid carers. They're using someone from their family unit, but that's not an employment law question. But I just wanted to put that out there. No. So if there is, someone just mentioned that there's some government advice about furlough and PAs. Could we have a link to that, because I haven't seen that?
Yeah, that'd be great. So Olivia, who brought that forward, if you could just add a link to that on the question panel, we'll make sure that goes out. Thanks, Catherine. We'll come to Denise now.
Yes.
Hi, Denise.
Hiya. My question is, if a family member is offering the support, all the contracted staff, so I've got 4 contracted staff, so the direct payment's still coming in, so they can get their full salary, and that's fine. But we'll also have 3 bank staff who normally get their income through covering for holidays and training and things. So obviously no one's having holidays or training, so they are getting nothing. Could we furlough the 3 bank staff as an average of that the last 12 months?
The guidance which the government put out suggests that you can, because they seem to be employees with variable payments, and therefore that suggests that you can furlough them and make a claim on the job retention fund for 80% of what they get. It's obviously a question of how often do you use these 4 bank staff?
Well, they're sort of used every month at some level, they all have different amounts. My concern is that if I don't furlough them and at least give them 80%, then they'll go and get a job in a supermarket, or they'll go and get a job somewhere else, and when this is all over, I won't have them.
Yeah, as I say, it looks as it can't be definitive, because to be quite a bit of a mess, and they only have
Oh, your sound's going, Stephen, up and down again.
It only becomes completely clear how things work once you're a few months into it. But it does seem to suggest that if you have an employee who's on variable pay, as the bank staff are, you should be able to.
I can't hear.
Is that any better?
I can hear you now, but I missed the last bit.
As I say, the guidance we've got does suggest that if you have.
Oh, Stephen, it's going again, so we're not hearing that.
This is very frustrating. Testing.
Direct in front of you. No, I can't hear you.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
That's better.
Is that still working?
Yes.
Okay. The guidance we've got says that if you've got employees whose pay varies, and you could say that that does apply to bank staff as long as they tick the boxes for being employees, and they've been employed by you for at least 12 months, then you can make a claim based on their average earnings over the last year.
I've got one of them who's only been with us about 4 months. Could we average her earnings out over the 4 months?
Yeah, actually, it seems that you would be able to, yes, and then you can make a claim for 80% of whatever it is that comes to from the job retention fund. Obviously, you can't make a claim on that until the end of April, or well, hopefully by the end of April, but it should be possible to make a claim for that.
That's great. Can I just ask, the previous lady mentioned about people being worried about whether or not the direct payment will continue if you haven't been using it. Will that be getting addressed at a different webinar, or is there any information on that?
there's some guidance that's meant to be coming out this week or early next week. So yes, we'll try and do a direct webinar. We said that after the access to care one, we would do another one that's around how that's working in practice. So yeah, we'll definitely get that on our list. Thanks, Denise.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm going to come to Jane now. Are you all right, Stephen, to take some more?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So Jane, hi Jane. Jane, you're self-muted. Okay, Jane self-muted. I'll come back to you. Karen is also self-muted. Okay, I'm going to come to Mandy. Hi,
yeah,
Mandy.
hi. Yeah, hi. A quick question for you. If a family member moves in to come and help and they're not on the books, how do we go about actually paying them?
Obviously, you, in those circumstances, your budget probably doesn't provide anything to pay them from. And as I said in the talk, you're still contractually obliged to pay your other employees. You might be able to say that you furloughed the other employees because obviously there's for health reasons you don't want them attending, and then try to reclaim 80% of what you paid them and make the payment to the family member from that. Difficulty there is that you can't actually make claims on the job retention fund at the moment. You can only start doing it at the end of April, and I can't give you an answer as to whether HMRC would turn around and say, no, we don't believe this is a proper furlough because you got somebody else in to do the work. I would hope that they wouldn't, but you will unfortunately be running a slight risk of that in those circumstances. An alternative, and again, you can't force this on your PAs, but you could say to your PAs, look, I'm going to have to furlough you, and I'd like to reduce your pay to 80%, and then use the difference between their full salary and the amount you're paying them to pay the family member. But
yeah, I mean,
you can't oblige a PA to agree to accept less than their full salary.
yeah, I mean, I have actually. Yeah, I mean, I have actually furloughed our member because I've got 4 vulnerable people in our house, and she's actually agreed to that and was quite happy with that. But I had said if the council, obviously this has all changed now, I did say that we would pay her out of our own pocket if we had to, because I think there's a big fear with a lot of families is, which someone else mentioned, is this whole thing of actually a respite worker who is so excellent going off and ended up getting another job somewhere else. And I think we're all in a situation where we're all quite scared about that happening as well. Our social worker has spoken to us, and she did give me permission, because my niece actually does live with us, and she actually gave us permission for us to continue paying my niece because she is on the books. But the situation we've got is my sister-in-law was going to move. Is going to come to move in. She is isolated at the moment. She's going to come and move in, but we had started the situation of trying to put her on the books. So would I be able to pay like that and actually pay the family member if we put our family members on the books? Can people start a process of putting them on the books now, or would they say no, you can't do that now because I
don't see why you can't start going through the process. Obviously you've spoken to the social worker who said it's okay, so that will make it much easier. It's just whether the budget is going to be increased to cover it, I'd be skeptical of. And so if you can persuade your external PAs to accept less whilst they're not having to come to work, so that you do have money to potentially pay from the budget, that obviously helps. And equally, there is the potential to, if you have furloughed the external ones, to make a claim on the job retention fund, on the basis that you had to furlough them for health and safety, and then you needed the budget to employ somebody else to do the work, and therefore it's appropriate to make a claim there.
Okay.
It was slightly speculative, but I think that certainly at the end of the day, the most important thing is to make sure that the care is provided in a safe way. So ultimately, and without wanting to be the bearer of bad news, if that does mean saying to them, you're paying something out of your own pocket, that's probably the lesser of two evils. But I think that there should be ways to either reach agreements with the PA so that you do have a fund for the family members, or alternatively make a claim on the job retention fund.
Okay, all right, brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Mandy. I'm going to try Karen again. Okay, Karen's still self-muted, and I'll try Jane. Jane, can you unmute yourself?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
There,
Hi.
yeah.
Hiya. I was just wondering, because my dad has 24-hour living care, if, God forbid, my dad and my carer was to have to go in self-isolation because of one of them showing signs because they do living care, will the other person that's not actually able to come into work but willing be able to be paid the full amount or the 80%?
Well, under their employment contract, unless they agree to take less than the full amount, they're entitled to be paid in full. But it's the 80% is the amount you may be able to reclaim from the job retention fund in due course. But I would have thought in those circumstances the full direct payment would still be paid to you, and therefore you should have the funds to make the payment to the one who's effectively furloughed pending the end of the self-isolation period.
Yeah, my worry is at the minute there's enough in the account to cover. I'm assuming for a couple of weeks, haven't worked it out exactly. But my worry is if obviously you're paying somebody for doing extra hours because they can't physically leave, and then the person that's obviously off is entitled to full pay, how long that'll actually run to because of having to wait so long to apply for the furloughed amount.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, unless you can persuade the one who's been furloughed to defer his claim for payment or to accept a lesser amount, you're still formally obliged to pay them. On a practical note, if you say I can only pay you this amount so at the moment because I've had to use the budget to pay the extra to the guy who's providing permanent care, but we'll make it up once I get the furlough amount. It's very difficult for somebody to enforce things at the moment because all the courts and tribunals are shut down. But I don't recommend falling out with people.
Oh God, no! I mean, my stuff amazing. And I feel like everybody else that I've heard today, to get staff, especially when it's such a lot of care, when it's 24 hours, there's only a couple of us, so that's hard enough anyway when sickness and stuff happens, because you can't just have somebody and when. And I've had my staff for a long time, and I think everybody's worried about losing the staff for all this. Thank you for clearing that up. I have got a couple of other questions, but I don't know if you've got time to take them.
Okay, can we leave it just there, Jim, just for a minute, just to check how much time Stephen's got and whether Kerry's got others from the written questions?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. So, Stephen, how are you for time? Can you go on for?
I can go on for a few more minutes. No problem.
Okay, so Kerry, is there any others that have come through on the question panel?
There's absolutely loads of questions, Julie. I think absolutely loads. It's really hard to kind of pick because there's such a range, really. I think, can we unmute Anna? Anna Severite?
Yes.
Do that. Anna, you had a couple of questions.
Oh, I did. What did I say? I can't remember what I typed. Sorry, that was one.
So Annie, you were talking about whether if your PAs are off sick, can you still pay them full pay?
Yes, so my local authority have, say I have to use this direct payment support service, and they won't let me pay somebody full rate of, like, they'll only let me pay for someone that's done the work as such. So if I wanted to pay full rate and not FSP, I couldn't sign and the PA couldn't sign to say they'd worked those hours. So I would be in a situation, I think, where I couldn't actually do that. So
they don't actually pay you. You don't get a direct payment. You get a.
Well, I do get a direct payment, but through the council still controls it a lot. They kind of
although it's a direct payment, they still, through the auditing process and through this payroll provider, sort of put loads of rules in place.
Although you have a budget, they say, well, if you haven't used all the budget because so and so has been off sick and therefore you're only obliged to pay them SSP, we're not going to make up that to the full amount.
Yeah.
Because obviously you are, unless their employment contract says that they get paid full sick pay, and I'd be surprised if it does. All they're entitled to be paid when they're off sick or self-isolating is SSP, and therefore, unless you wanted to put your hand in your own pocket to make up the difference, I'm afraid you're stuck with what the council is prepared to pay.
Yeah.
Whether you could, Okay.
Yeah, and Anna, what I'd also suggest is that with the guidance that's coming out, we're hoping to that it really strongly advises flexibility around direct payments. So it might be worth writing to your council saying, look, this is my contingency plan. I'm going to need this PA after they're self-isolated. Therefore, I want to do full-time retention. Unless you come back and tell me I can't, I want to go ahead and do that. And almost classify pay retention rather than paid sick leave. This is just tips from
I'll put it like that. Thank you.
Asserted themselves slightly different.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Should we do one more? Should we? Oh, Karen's gone offline now. So I wonder whether we finish there now. It's just gone 12 o'clock. There are a lot of questions that are still on the question panel. So I'm hoping that Stephen might take a look at them.
What I was going to suggest is if you could maybe sort of summarise put them into classes in the general main questions, and I can probably do some a further presentation just giving some thoughts on them. Obviously that will be fairly general rather than specific to the individual circumstances, but hopefully it will help.
That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephen, for doing this webinar. Thank you to everybody for attending. The webinar has been recorded and will be put up for people to see. And as Stephen says, we'll carry on doing the list of questions and get them into a document that will also be put on the Be Human page. Thanks very much for attending. Take care.